I watched from my living room window as the HOA president's BMW pulled into my driveway at 7 in the morning, and I already knew this conversation was going to ruin my entire weekend. The decorations had only been up for 3 days, but apparently that was 3 days too many for Patricia Henderson and her band of suburban enforcers. My winter display was modest compared to some of my neighbors. Just a large inflatable snowman, some tasteful LED icicle lights, and the centerpiece that was apparently causing all the fuss. A 6-foot-tall wooden menorah I had built myself, painted in blues and whites with electric candles that glowed warmly each evening. My name is Nathan Foster, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Columbus, Ohio, for exactly 2 years. The neighborhood was pleasant enough, with its manicured lawns and cookie-cutter colonials, but the HOA had a reputation for being overzealous about enforcement. I had heard the stories from other residents about petty violations and ridiculous fines, but I had managed to stay under their radar until now. That was about to change dramatically. I opened the door before Patricia could ring the bell, hoping to keep this conversation outside where my wife, Sarah, would not have to deal with the stress. She was 8 months pregnant with our first child, and the last thing she needed was HOA drama. "Nathan," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false politeness. She was in her mid-50s with a blonde bob that looked like it required weekly salon maintenance and a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "We need to discuss your holiday decorations." "Good morning to you too, Patricia," I replied, crossing my arms. "What seems to be the problem?" She gestured toward my front yard with a manicured hand. "The menorah. It is not an approved holiday decoration according to our HOA guidelines." Section 12. Subsection 4 clearly states that only traditional Christmas decorations are permitted during the winter season. I felt my jaw tighten. That is interesting, because I read the guidelines pretty thoroughly before putting anything up. The section you are referring to says traditional winter holiday decorations, not specifically Christmas decorations. Hanukkah is a winter holiday. Patricia's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. "Nathan, let's not play word games. You know what the intent of the rule is. This is a family-friendly Christian community, and we maintain certain standards. Actually, this is a residential community in the United States of America," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "My family celebrates Hanukkah. That menorah is a traditional winter holiday decoration, and it is staying up." "Then you will receive a formal violation notice," Patricia said, pulling out her phone and taking several photos of my front yard. "And if you do not remove it within 48 hours, you will be fined $500. The fines will continue at that rate for each week the violation persists." "This is religious discrimination," I said flatly. "This is HOA covenant enforcement," Patricia countered. "You signed these agreements when you purchased your home. If you cannot abide by the community standards, perhaps Meadowbrook Estates is not the right fit for you." She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, leaving me standing in the doorway with my blood pressure through the roof. Sarah appeared behind me, her hand on her swollen belly. "What did she want?" Sarah asked quietly. "They want us to take down the menorah," I said, watching Patricia's BMW disappear around the corner. "She says it is not an approved decoration." Sarah's face fell. "Nathan, is this really worth fighting over? Maybe we could just put it in the backyard or wait until next year to deal with it." I turned to look at her, and I could see the worry in her eyes. She was not wrong to be concerned. Fighting with the HOA would be expensive, stressful, and time-consuming. But something about Patricia's smug certainty, her casual dismissal of our religious traditions, made me absolutely certain that I could not let this slide. "This is our home," I said gently, taking Sarah's hand. "And we should be able to celebrate our faith without some neighborhood busybody telling us what is and is not acceptable. If I back down now, what message does that send? What kind of example is that for our kid?" Sarah sighed but squeezed my hand. "Just promise me you will be smart about this. We cannot afford a legal battle right now." I promised, even though I had no idea how I was going to keep that promise. The violation notice arrived in my mailbox the next morning, printed on official HOA letterhead and filled with legalese about covenant violations and fine schedules. I took photos of it and filed it away, then did some research. The first attorney I contacted was not interested. The second told me that HOA cases were complicated and expensive, and that I would probably spend more on legal fees than I would just paying the fines and taking down the menorah. The third attorney, a woman named Rebecca Steinberg who specialized in First Amendment cases, actually listened to my story. "This is exactly the kind of case that makes my blood boil," Rebecca said over the phone. She had a sharp, confident voice that immediately put me at ease. "HOAs think they can steamroll over constitutional rights just because they have a set of covenants and bylaws. How much are they trying to fine you?" $500 a week, until I remove the menorah," I said. "And they are threatening additional sanctions if I do not comply." "Do you have the HOA guidelines in writing, specifically the section about holiday decorations?" I pulled up the PDF on my computer and read her the exact wording. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Nathan, this is even better than I thought," Rebecca said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "The guidelines do not specify Christian decorations only. They say traditional winter holiday decorations. That is textbook viewpoint discrimination. They are allowing certain religious displays while prohibiting others based solely on the religious viewpoint expressed." "So you think we have a case?" I asked, hope rising in my chest. "I think we have a very strong case. First Amendment protections extend to private HOAs when they engage in viewpoint discrimination regarding religious expression. There is solid precedent here. I am going to be honest with you, though. This will not be quick or easy. Are you prepared for a real fight?" I thought about Patricia's smug face, about the implication that my family's traditions were somehow less valid than the Christmas decorations covering every other lawn in the neighborhood. I thought about my unborn child and the world I wanted them to grow up in. "I am prepared," I said. Rebecca took my case on a partial contingency basis, which meant I had to pay some upfront costs, but she would collect the bulk of her fees from the HOA if we won. We filed a federal lawsuit 3 days before the first fine was due, naming the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, and Patricia Henderson individually as defendants. The lawsuit alleged violations of my First Amendment rights, religious discrimination, and selective enforcement of HOA regulations. The backlash from my neighbors started almost immediately. I came home from work the next day to find my mailbox knocked over and "lawsuit" spray painted across it in red letters. Sarah called me in tears, saying that several women from her prenatal yoga class had stopped talking to her. The HOA sent out a mass email to all residents claiming that I was trying to destroy the community's property values and traditional character. But not everyone was against us. My next-door neighbor, Tom Rivera, came over that evening with a beer and a handshake. "I just want you to know that some of us think what you are doing is right," Tom said. "We were standing in my garage away from prying eyes. Patricia and her crew have been bullying people for years. Last summer, they tried to fine my mother-in-law for parking her car in our driveway for more than 3 days while she was visiting. They are out of control." "Thanks, man," I said, genuinely touched. "It means a lot to hear that. If you need a witness or a statement or anything, let me know," Tom said. "I have been documenting their selective enforcement for years. Did you know they let the Johnsons put up a massive nativity scene that technically violates the size restrictions, but they cited me for having one too many solar garden lights? That information turned out to be gold for our case." Rebecca was thrilled when I told her about the selective enforcement, and she immediately sent out discovery requests demanding records of all HOA violations and enforcement actions for the past 5 years. The first hearing was scheduled for mid-December, just a few weeks away. In the meantime, the HOA was not backing down. They sent me a formal invoice for $500, which I refused to pay. They sent another one the following week. Patricia started parking her car on the street in front of my house during her daily walks, making a big show of photographing my menorah and shaking her head disapprovingly. The local media got wind of the story after someone leaked it to a reporter at the Columbus Dispatch. Suddenly, I was getting calls from newspapers, TV stations, and even a few national news outlets. Rebecca advised me to do a few strategic interviews to build public support for our case, but to be careful about what I said. The interview with Channel 4 News aired on a Tuesday evening. The reporter, a young woman named Michelle Carter, did a fair and balanced piece that showed my menorah alongside the elaborate Christmas displays on my street and let me explain the situation in my own words. "I am not asking the HOA to take down anyone else's decorations," I said to the camera. "I am just asking for the same right to celebrate my faith that my Christian neighbors have. That is what America is supposed to be about." The story went viral. By the next morning, my case was trending on social media, and I had messages of support from people all over the country. But I also had death threats in my inbox and angry voicemails calling me everything from a troublemaker to much worse things I would not repeat. Sarah was scared, and I could not blame her. We installed security cameras around the house, and I started working from home more often to keep an eye on things. The stress was taking a toll on both of us, but especially on Sarah. Her doctor warned her that her blood pressure was elevated and she needed to reduce stress for the baby's sake. "Maybe we should drop the lawsuit," Sarah said one night, lying in bed with her hand on her belly. "This is not worth risking our baby's health." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. She was right, of course. Nothing was worth risking our child. But I also knew that if I backed down now, the HOA would see it as validation of their discriminatory policies. They would continue to bully and intimidate anyone who did not fit their narrow definition of acceptable. "Let me talk to Rebecca," I said. "Maybe we can find a way to expedite things or reach some kind of settlement." But when I called Rebecca the next morning, she had different news. "Nathan, the HOA's attorney just called me. They want to discuss a settlement. I think they are getting nervous about the media attention." My heart leaped. What kind of settlement? They are willing to update their guidelines to explicitly allow all religious holiday displays, not just Christian ones. They will drop all fines against you and issue a public apology. But they want you to drop the lawsuit and agree not to pursue legal fees. "What do you think?" I asked. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I think we can do better. Their case is weak and they know it. The selective enforcement evidence Tom gave us is damning, and the language in their current guidelines is indefensible. If we go to trial, I believe we will win, and we can force them to pay our legal fees and possibly damages. But that could take months," I said. "My wife is pregnant and stressed out. I do not know if we can handle a prolonged legal battle." That is a decision only you can make, Rebecca said gently. But I want you to know that what you are doing matters. This is not just about you and your menorah. This is about setting a precedent that HOAs cannot discriminate based on religion. If you settle now without recovering legal fees, other people in similar situations will not be able to afford to fight. She was right, and I knew it. I talked it over with Sarah that night, and we made the decision together to reject the settlement offer and proceed with the case. It was one of the hardest decisions we had ever made, but it felt right. The HOA was furious when we rejected their settlement offer. Patricia ramped up her harassment campaign, sending me multiple violation notices for increasingly petty things. My grass was allegedly a quarter-inch too long. My garbage cans were visible from the street for more than 30 minutes after collection. My car was parked at a slight angle in my driveway. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine was documented by Rebecca for our lawsuit. The discovery phase of the case was revealing in ways I had not anticipated. The HOA was forced to turn over years of enforcement records, and the pattern of selective enforcement was stunning. Homes with Christmas decorations were almost never cited for violations, even when they clearly exceeded size or brightness restrictions. Meanwhile, homes with no decorations or non-Christian decorations received citations at a much higher rate for all kinds of minor infractions. Rebecca found one particularly egregious example. A family who had put up a small display for Diwali 2 years earlier had received multiple violation notices and eventually been fined into removing their decorations. The HOA's justification at the time was that the decorations were not in keeping with community standards. That family had ultimately moved out of the neighborhood rather than continue fighting. "This is going to be exhibit at trial," Rebecca told me, waving the printed emails. "They have a documented history of religious discrimination. This is not just about you, Nathan. This is a pattern and practice." The preliminary hearing in mid-December was my first time seeing Patricia and the other HOA board members in a courtroom setting. Patricia showed up with 3 other board members and an attorney from some big law firm in downtown Columbus. They all looked extremely confident, like this was just a minor inconvenience they would quickly swat away. Judge Martin Hendricks presided over the hearing. He was an older man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, and he had a reputation as a no-nonsense judge who did not tolerate games in his courtroom. Rebecca presented our preliminary arguments, focusing on the First Amendment issues and the pattern of selective enforcement. The HOA's attorney, a man named Douglas Whitmore who wore a suit that probably cost more than my car, argued that HOA covenants were private contracts and that we had agreed to abide by them when we purchased our home. "Your Honor, this is simply a matter of contract enforcement," Whitmore said smoothly. "Mr. Foster signed a legally binding agreement when he purchased his property. He cannot now claim constitutional protections to violate that agreement." Judge Hendricks looked at him over his glasses. "Counselor, are you arguing that HOA covenants can override First Amendment protections?" "Not override, Your Honor, but the First Amendment traditionally applies to government action, not private contractual agreements. Except when those private agreements involve viewpoint discrimination regarding religious expression," Rebecca interjected. "The case law is quite clear that HOAs cannot selectively enforce rules in a way that discriminates based on religious viewpoint." The judge looked at the documents in front of him, then at Patricia and the other board members. "I have reviewed the HOA guidelines in question, and I have reviewed the enforcement records provided in discovery. I am going to be frank with you, Mr. Whitmore. Your clients appear to have a serious problem here. The guidelines do not specify Christian-only decorations, yet the enforcement pattern suggests that is how they have been interpreted. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, I would argue that our enforcement has been consistent with community standards and expectations. Community standards do not override constitutional protections, Judge Hendricks said sharply. I am denying the HOA's motion to dismiss. This case will proceed to trial. I am also issuing a preliminary injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing any fines or sanctions against Mr. Foster related to his menorah display while this case is pending. I wanted to cheer, but I kept my composure. Rebecca squeezed my arm as we left the courtroom. That went very well, she whispered. The judge sees through their arguments. We have a real shot here. But Patricia was not done. As we walked out of the courthouse, she made a point of getting close enough to speak to me. You are destroying this community, Nathan. I hope you are proud of yourself. I am proud of standing up for my rights, I replied calmly. Maybe you should spend less time trying to control what decorations people put up and more time actually building community. Her face went red, but before she could respond, Whitmore pulled her away. Rebecca and I went to a nearby coffee shop to debrief and plan our next steps. The trial is scheduled for February, Rebecca said, pulling out her calendar. That gives us about 2 months to prepare. I want to depose Patricia and the other board members, and I want to interview some of your neighbors about the selective enforcement. Tom Rivera will testify, I said, and I think I can find a few others who have had issues with the HOA. Good. The more evidence we have of a pattern and practice of discrimination, the stronger our case. I also want to bring in an expert witness on HOA law and First Amendment protections. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca was a force of nature. She deposed all 4 HOA board members, and their testimonies were revealing. Under oath, none of them could provide a coherent explanation for why Christmas decorations were acceptable, but Hanukkah decorations were not. Patricia, in particular, had a disastrous deposition where she repeatedly referred to traditional American values and maintaining our Christian heritage before Whitmore cut her off. She basically admitted religious discrimination on the record, Rebecca told me gleefully after Patricia's deposition. Whitmore looked like he wanted to die. He knows they are in trouble. Christmas came and went. My menorah stayed up for all 8 nights of Hanukkah, glowing defiantly in my front yard while news crews occasionally drove by to film it. On the last night, Tom Rivera and a few other supportive neighbors came over for lax and sufganiyat. It was a small gesture of solidarity, but it meant everything to Sarah and me. In January, Sarah's doctor put her on partial bed rest. The stress and her advancing pregnancy were taking a toll, and I felt guilty for putting her through this. But Sarah, stubborn as always, insisted we see the case through. Our baby is going to be born into a world where we stood up for what is right, she said, her hand on her belly. That matters, Nathan. Do not give up now. The HOA made one more settlement offer in late January, this time proposing to pay $50,000 and revise their guidelines. It was tempting, especially with the baby coming and our legal costs mounting despite Rebecca's contingency arrangement. But Rebecca pointed out that $50,000 would not even cover half of what we had spent on the case, and more importantly, it would not send the message we needed to send. They are trying to buy their way out of accountability, Rebecca said. If you settle now, they will just be more careful about how they discriminate in the future. We need a court ruling that makes it crystal clear that what they did was illegal. I agreed, and we rejected the second settlement offer. Whitmore was not happy. He sent Rebecca a nasty email suggesting that we were being unreasonable and prolonging the case unnecessarily. Rebecca forwarded it to me with a single word: desperate. The trial began on February 10th. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and some of my neighbors. I saw Tom Rivera and a few friendly faces in the gallery, but I also saw Patricia and several of her allies, all of them staring daggers at me. Judge Hendricks called the court to order, and we began with opening statements. Rebecca laid out our case methodically, walking the jury through the HOA guidelines, the pattern of selective enforcement, and the specific discrimination I had faced. She showed photos of elaborate Christmas displays that had never received violation notices next to my modest menorah. She showed emails from the HOA discussing how to handle non-traditional decorations. She showed the records from the Diwali family who had been harassed out of the neighborhood. "This case is about religious freedom," Rebecca told the jury. "It is about the fundamental American right to practice your faith without discrimination. The defendants want you to believe this is about property values and neighborhood aesthetics, but the evidence will show that this is really about enforcing a narrow, Christian-only vision of what holiday decorations are acceptable." Whitmore's opening statement focused on the sanctity of contracts and property rights. He argued that HOA covenants were voluntary agreements that homeowners entered into knowingly, and that the HOA had a right and obligation to enforce those covenants uniformly. "Mr. Foster is not being discriminated against," Whitmore argued. "He is simply being held to the same standards as every other homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates. If we allow homeowners to pick and choose which rules they follow based on personal preference, the entire concept of planned communities falls apart." The first witness was Patricia Henderson herself. Rebecca handled her cross-examination with surgical precision, walking her through years of enforcement records and forcing her to explain why certain violations were cited while others were ignored. "Mrs. Henderson, can you explain why the Johnson family's nativity scene, which exceeds the size limitations in the guidelines, has never received a violation notice?" Rebecca asked, showing a photo of the massive display. "The nativity scene is a traditional Christmas decoration," Patricia said defensively. "It is in keeping with community standards. And Mr. Foster's menorah, which is within the size limitations, is not in keeping with community standards. It is not a traditional decoration for this community." But the guidelines do not say traditional decorations for this community. They say traditional winter holiday decorations. Is Hanukkah not a winter holiday? Patricia stumbled over her answer and Whitmore objected, but the damage was done. The jury could see exactly what this case was about. We called Tom Rivera as a witness, and he testified about the years of selective enforcement he had witnessed. We called the family who had been harassed over their Diwali decorations, and they told their story with visible emotion. We called an expert witness on HOA law who testified that the Meadowbrook Estates guidelines, as enforced, constituted viewpoint discrimination in violation of the First Amendment. The HOA's defense was weak. They called several board members who gave vague testimony about trying to maintain property values. They called a real estate agent who testified that consistent neighborhood aesthetics were important for home values, but admitted under cross-examination that there was no evidence my menorah had negatively impacted anyone's property value. They called several neighbors who complained about the media attention and disruption, but Rebecca effectively pointed out that the disruption came from the HOA's discriminatory enforcement, not from my decorations. The most dramatic moment of the trial came on the fourth day, when Rebecca played a recording that Tom had made at an HOA board meeting 2 years earlier. In the recording, Patricia could be clearly heard saying, "We need to maintain the Christian character of this neighborhood. If we start allowing all kinds of different religious displays, it will change the whole feel of Meadowbrook Estates." The courtroom went silent. Whitmore looked like he had been slapped. Patricia went pale. Judge Hendricks leaned forward in his chair. "Mrs. Henderson, is that your voice on that recording?" Rebecca asked. I do not recall that specific meeting," Patricia stammered. "But that sounds like your voice, does it not? Perhaps, but you are taking it out of context. What context makes that statement acceptable?" Patricia could not answer. Whitmore tried to object, but Judge Hendricks overruled him. The jury had heard everything they needed to hear. Closing arguments happened on day 5 of the trial. Rebecca hammered home the evidence of religious discrimination and selective enforcement. Whitmore tried to salvage the case by focusing on property rights and contractual obligations, but it was clear his heart was not in it anymore. He knew they had lost. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they came back, the foreperson, a middle-aged black woman named Dorothy Williams, read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Nathan Foster, on all counts. We find that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA violated Mr. Foster's First Amendment rights through viewpoint discrimination. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $50,000 and punitive damages in the amount of $150,000. We further order the defendants to pay all of the plaintiff's legal costs and attorney's fees." I felt Sarah grab my hand and squeeze it hard. Rebecca was grinning from ear to ear. Behind us, I heard Tom Rivera quietly say "yes" under his breath. Across the courtroom, Patricia sat frozen in her seat, her face a mask of shock and anger. Judge Hendricks thanked the jury and then addressed the HOA directly. "I want to be very clear about something. What you did here was not just a violation of HOA guidelines or a contractual dispute. You engaged in deliberate religious discrimination, and you did so with full awareness of what you were doing. That is unacceptable in America in the 21st century. I am ordering you to immediately revise your HOA guidelines to explicitly permit religious holiday displays of all faiths. You will provide anti-discrimination training to all board members, and you will issue a written apology to Mr. Foster and to any other residents you have discriminated against." He banged his gavel, and it was over. Sarah and I walked out of the courthouse into a sea of reporters and cameras. Rebecca handled most of the questions, making it clear that this was a victory not just for us, but for religious freedom and fair treatment in HOAs across the country. "This case sends a clear message," Rebecca told the cameras. HOAs cannot pick and choose which religious expressions are acceptable based on their own biases. The First Amendment protects all of us, even in private residential communities. The story made national news that night. My phone exploded with messages of congratulations from friends, family, and complete strangers. Sarah cried happy tears, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had not realized I was carrying. But the saga was not quite over. 2 days after the verdict, I received a certified letter from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Inside was a formal apology, signed by all 4 board members, acknowledging their discriminatory conduct and apologizing for the harassment and stress they had caused my family. There was also a check for $200,000, the full amount of damages awarded by the jury. The revised HOA guidelines arrived a week later. The new language was explicit and comprehensive, protecting the rights of all residents to display religious holiday decorations of any faith, subject only to reasonable size and safety restrictions. that applied equally to all displays. The guidelines also included a new section on anti-discrimination policies and procedures for residents to report bias or unfair treatment. Patricia Henderson resigned from the HOA board the day after the verdict. So did two other board members who had been closely involved in the discriminatory enforcement. The remaining board members held emergency elections to fill the vacancies, and Tom Rivera was elected as the new president. One of his first acts was to send a letter to all residents apologizing for the previous board's conduct and committing to fair and equal treatment going forward. Sarah gave birth to our daughter, Emma Rose Foster, on March 15th. She was healthy and perfect, and when we brought her home from the hospital, there were welcome home balloons and cards from neighbors we had never even met. The Johnsons from 3 houses down, the ones with the massive nativity scene, brought over a casserole and a heartfelt apology. "We should have stood up for you when all this started," Mrs. Johnson said, tears in her eyes. "We were cowards and we are sorry. What Patricia did was wrong and we should have said something." "It is okay," I said, genuinely meaning it. "What matters is that things are different now." And they were different. Tom turned out to be an excellent HOA president, focused on building community rather than enforcing petty rules. He organized neighborhood barbecues and holiday parties that actually brought people together. He revised other problematic HOA policies and made the enforcement process more transparent and fair. The $200,000 from the lawsuit went a long way towards securing our family's future. We paid off a chunk of our mortgage, set up a college fund for Emma, and donated $50,000 to the Eclue Religious Freedom Project. Rebecca's legal fees were paid separately by the HOA, as ordered by the judge, and she told us that she had received several new clients with similar HOA discrimination issues as a result of the publicity from our case. The following December, our street looked like a celebration of diversity. The Johnsons had their nativity scene. We had our menorah, bigger and brighter than the previous year. The Riveras put up a beautiful display for Las Posadas. A Hindu family that had moved in over the summer put up Diwali decorations even though the holiday had technically passed, just to make a statement. A Muslim family flew a decorative banner that said, "Happy Holidays" in Arabic and English. The whole neighborhood had embraced the idea that we could celebrate our different traditions together, and it made the community stronger, not weaker. On the first night of Hanukkah, Tom organized a neighborhood winter festival in the common area. Families brought traditional foods from their various cultures and holidays. There was caroling and dancing and children running around with dreidels and candy canes. Emma, not quite a year old, was bundled up in her stroller, wide-eyed at all the lights and colors. Patricia Henderson had moved out of the neighborhood that fall, relocating to a different suburb where presumably she could find an HOA more to her liking. I felt no particular satisfaction in her departure. The goal had never been to drive anyone away, just to create space for everyone to belong. As I stood in the cold December evening, watching my neighbors celebrate together, Sarah came up beside me and slipped her hand into mine. "Was it worth it?" she asked softly. I looked at Emma in her stroller, then at the diverse crowd of neighbors who had become genuine friends, then at the menorah glowing proudly in our front yard. "Yes," I said, "it was absolutely worth it." The case of Foster v. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA set a precedent that was cited in several subsequent cases across the country. Other homeowners facing religious discrimination from their HOAs reached out to Rebecca, and she built a robust practice defending First Amendment rights in residential communities. The case was written up in law journals, and used as a teaching example in law school courses on constitutional rights and property law. For me, the impact was more personal. I had learned that standing up for what is right is rarely easy or convenient. It is stressful and expensive, and sometimes it puts strain on the people you love. But it is also necessary. If everyone backed down when faced with discrimination or injustice, nothing would ever change. Emma grew up in a neighborhood that valued diversity and inclusion, not because it was forced to by a court order, but because the community had learned an important lesson about respecting different traditions and beliefs. She would never know a world where her father's menorah was considered unacceptable, or where her family's faith was treated as less legitimate than anyone else's. The following summer, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA held its annual meeting, and it was the most well-attended meeting in the community's history. Tom presented a proposal to further revise the HOA covenants to include explicit anti-discrimination protections not just for religious displays, but for all aspects of community life. The proposal passed unanimously. During the open comment period, an older gentleman named Harold Fitzgerald stood up to speak. He had lived in Meadowbrook Estates since the neighborhood was first built 20 years earlier, and he had a reputation as a bit of a curmudgeon. "I want to say something," Harold said, his voice shaking slightly. "When all this business with Nathan and the menorah started, I thought he was being a troublemaker. I thought he should just go along to get along and not rock the boat. But I was wrong. What Patricia and the old board did was shameful, and I am ashamed that I did not speak up. This community is better now because Nathan had the courage to fight for what was right. So thank you, Nathan, and I am sorry I did not stand with you from the beginning." There was a long moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. Several other neighbors stood up to echo Harold's sentiments. It was an emotional moment, and I found myself fighting back tears. After the meeting, Rebecca called to check in. She had become not just my attorney but a genuine friend, and she liked to keep tabs on how things were going in Meadowbrook Estates. "I just heard about the meeting," she said. "Sounds like you are officially a neighborhood hero now." "I do not know about hero," I said, laughing. "But things are definitely good. How are your other HOA cases going?" "Really well, actually. The precedent from your case has made HOAs a lot more careful about discriminatory enforcement. We settled 2 cases already because the HOAs did not want to risk going to trial. And I have 3 more in the pipeline. You started something important, Nathan." That was gratifying to hear. I had never set out to be a crusader or a test case. I had just wanted to display my menorah in peace. But sometimes that is how change happens. One person standing up and saying, "No, this is not right, and I am not going to accept it." The financial impact of the lawsuit verdict continued to reverberate for the Meadowbrook Estates HOA for years. Their insurance premiums increased dramatically, and they had trouble finding board members willing to serve given the liability risks. Eventually, they brought in a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, which actually improved things considerably. The professional managers were less likely to let personal biases influence enforcement decisions, and they brought a level of consistency and fairness that had been lacking under Patricia's leadership. I occasionally wondered what had become of Patricia. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had tried to join the HOA board in her new community, but had been rejected after they did a background check and found news stories about our case. There was a certain poetic justice in that, though I tried not to take too much satisfaction from her difficulties. The point had never been revenge. It had been about justice and fairness. As Emma grew from a baby into a toddler and then a preschooler, she absorbed the lessons of diversity and inclusion that our neighborhood now embodied. Her best friend was Priya, the daughter of the Hindu family down the street. They celebrated Hanukkah together and Diwali together and Christmas with the Johnsons. To Emma, it was completely normal and natural that different families had different traditions, and that all of those traditions were equally valid and worthy of celebration. That more than anything else validated the struggle we had gone through. My daughter would grow up in a world where her father had stood up for her right to practice her faith openly and proudly. She would grow up knowing that when faced with injustice, you fight back. You do not back down just because it is hard or scary or expensive. One December evening, 5 years after the original lawsuit, I was out in the yard setting up our menorah. It was a new one, even larger and more beautiful than the original. Emma was helping me, chattering away about the Hanukkah party we were having at her school the next day. "Daddy, why do we put up the menorah?" Emma asked, her breath making little puffs of steam in the cold air. I thought about how to answer. I could give her the simple answer about Hanukkah traditions and the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days, but she deserved the fuller truth. "We put up the menorah because it is part of our tradition," I said, kneeling down to her eye level. "But we also put it up to show that we are proud of who we are and what we believe. A long time ago, before you were born, some people told Daddy that he could not put up the menorah. They said it was not allowed, and Daddy had to fight to prove that everyone has the right to celebrate their faith." Emma nodded seriously, processing this information. "And you won." "Yes, sweetie, we won." "Good," Emma said firmly, "because our menorah is really pretty and everyone should be able to see it." Out of the mouths of babes, as they say, it really was that simple. Our menorah was beautiful, our faith was important to us, and we had the right to share it with the world. The fact that it had taken a federal lawsuit to establish that right was unfortunate, but the fight had been worth it. That night, as the first candle glowed in our menorah, I stood with Sarah and Emma in our front yard and thought about everything that had happened. The stress and the anger and the fear had faded, replaced by pride and satisfaction and hope for the future. Our neighborhood was stronger and more united than it had been before the lawsuit. Our community had learned important lessons about respect and inclusion. And my family had established a legacy of standing up for what is right. The menorah burned brightly, a beacon of faith and freedom on a cold December night in Ohio. It represented not just a religious tradition, but a fundamental American principle: that all people have the right to practice their faith without discrimination, that justice and fairness matter, and that one person standing up for what is right can make a real difference. As we walked back into our warm house, I looked back one more time at the menorah glowing in the darkness. It had been a long journey from that first confrontation with Patricia Henderson to this moment of peace and satisfaction. But every step had been worth it. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is hard. Especially when the fight is hard. The case of Foster v. Meadowbrook Estates HOA would stand as a testament to that principle, a reminder that the First Amendment protections we cherish are not self-executing. They require ordinary people to have the courage to stand up and defend them. I had been that person for my family and my community, and I would carry that responsibility with pride for the rest of my life. The menorah would shine every December for years to come, a symbol of faith, of freedom, and of the enduring American promise that all people, regardless of their religion or background, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. That was the legacy I was leaving for Emma and for all the children growing up in Meadowbrook Estates, and that made everything we had been through worthwhile.